Hey, welcome back. It's Joel Duff. Let me tell you a story. The story of my life. Oh, okay. That sounds kind of boring. But wait a second. I've got 1,000 subscribers, and they say that when you hit 1,000 subscribers, it's like you're somehow obligated to have like a special show about having 1,000 subscribers. I thought, that's a bunch of nonsense. Don't need to do that. Just keep making my videos. But then I thought, you know what? There are 1,000 subscribers. And I know that a bunch of you don't really know who this dude is with this crazy beard that's getting out of control and speaking to you through this computer or your phone. So you're subscribed to my channel for some reason. And it almost certainly has to do with something about the content that sparks some interest. So I thought maybe if I try to explain why I'm obsessed with making the content on this station, and recognize that you find this content interesting. So maybe it's possible that there's something about my story, how I came to be where I'm at and why I'm doing what I'm doing. What are my motivations? Joel, why are you spending so much time on this? What if I explain that, my story? Maybe my story will sound a little bit like your story and your interest. Maybe you'll find some connection there. Maybe you'll realize, why am I listening to this guy anymore? And you'll unsubscribe. That's fine too. So I think if you know more about my purpose, my goal, my intentions, I think that's going to help you understand my motivations and potentially, help make that content a little bit more meaningful. So let's talk a little bit about like how I got to be where I'm at. Why am I doing this YouTube thing? And why do I talk so much about creationism? What's up with that? Let's talk about that coming up. The year was 1998. No, that's not when I was born, and we're not going to go that far back. In 1998, I was a postdoc at the time. I was invited to the home of one of the leaders of the church that I was a member of to discuss the topic of creationism. The invitation appeared to be spurred by my increased vocalization within the church and in the broader Christian community at the time, which raised many questions about what's exactly that Duff's position on the topic of the age of the earth and my views on origins in general. This encounter that I had at this home of a leader of a church, right, represented a really critical confluence of multiple experiences that had shaped my opinions up to that point in my life and from then on. It was a really big deal, but you're going to have to wait. I can't tell you exactly what happened just yet. I got to fill you in on a little of the backstory. We do have to do a little bit of history lesson and talk about who I was, how I came to be there at that particular moment in time. And then we'll find out how did that affect me going forward. So my active interest at that particular time, right, in 1998, was studying and writing on the topic of creationism. Now, that wasn't my job as a postdoc. I was doing research on parasitic plants. In fact, I was working on chloroplast genomes and parasitic plants. So I was sequencing portions of genes of these plants and doing all kinds of other side projects, right? It was really great, a very productive time in my career. So I was doing this plant molecular biology as a postdoctoral research associate at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. And that was right after I'd finished my PhD from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville from the Department of Botany. Now, these studies and my long-term interest in geology as well, which you've noticed if you've watched any of my videos, kind of brought me to a point where I was really reflecting and evaluating my career and my personal interest in light of my orthodox evangelical upbringing and training. I hate to use that word evangelical because carries a lot of baggage in terms of people's ideas of the definitions of that, but there's not a better word for that. So I'm calling it my orthodox evangelical upbringing. And we'll see that coming along. Now that latter interest, right, my orthodox evangelical upbringing, can be attributed to the fact that my father's a pastor in a small Reformed denomination called the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. And I myself have maintained membership in some form of Reformed Presbyterian denomination my entire life, and steadfastly claim that particular faith to this particular day. So that's obviously has a large influence on some of the things and the topics I bring up on this particular channel. In addition to this immersion in the Reformed faith from a very early age, I providentially grew up surrounded by the majestic geological formations of western Colorado and southern Utah. living on the very edge of Grand Junction, Colorado, I was able to readily ride my bike out into the wilderness, collect fossils and rocks. And I've made a recent video on that. Maybe I'll link to that at the bottom of this one, but I made a whole video on like my first experience with deep time, my discovery of deep time. And that was riding my bike, collecting fossils in my backyard, essentially in Grand Junction, Colorado. So whole video on that. My contact with this natural world grew into an interest in all fields of science, which continued through high school in Southern California. Despite my heritage as a son, a grandson, a nephew of Reformed Presbyterian ministers, I entered Calvin College, which is in Grand Rapids, Michigan, determined to pursue a career in physics. And I wanted to be involved in either being an atom smasher, all right? I wanted to look at the properties of the very smallest bits of nature, or I wanted to be an astrophysicist, right? I wanted to be an astronomer. I wanted to look at the biggest things in the universe. Now, something happened there. I discovered that if you want to be in either one of those fields, or physics in general, you have to be a little bit above average in terms of your mathematics skills. And I quickly discovered that was a skill I did not possess, all right, to put it mildly. Physics wasn't going to be for me. And so I had to decide on some other career path fairly early on. And so I had to abandon physics, and I decided I would love to study geology. I mean, I just love geology. But at the time, the program at Calvin, the year I was there was the first year they started their geology degree. So, and they only had, I think there was three faculty members in geology. And I didn't particularly care for one. And my naive opinion is that with only 2 or 3 faculty, how could you possibly get a decent degree? Because you'd have to take the same faculty several times. And I just wasn't convinced that there was enough variety of classes. I was totally wrong about that. I would have been completely fine. I would have learned plenty of basic geological information. I could have gone on to graduate school. But I thought, in my infinite wisdom of just looking at myself and looking at the program and not actually talking to anyone, like any advisor or any other faculty member, because I was such an introvert, that I ended up not going into geology. Now, those are the ways of providence, right? So I ended up saying, well, what else am I going to do? I've got to do some kind of science. And, I thought about chemistry, and I thought, that sounds like some math too. But you can hide in biology, in some areas of biology, without having especially good skills, right? Mathematics skills. Off to biology I went, and I've been stuck in biology ever since. So now, as I kind of reflect back on what is very much a fading memory of my college days at Calvin, I don't really remember having to seriously grapple with the big questions, all right? The questions of the age of the earth. Although I do remember being presented with like some different perspectives in a couple different courses, especially my historical geology course. And so my lack of reflection, I think, on that topic is I just don't remember having intense conversations about the age of the earth, evolution. It's just kind of like I learned stuff, not really challenged on those topics. I think it was largely due to the fact that it just wasn't discussed in the church I went to, right? I attended the same church for all 4 years when I was at Calvin College. And although that wasn't something that was on the mind of the pastor there, and I would get periodic questions from people about like what I did, but they're like, once I said biology, their eyes glazed over and they didn't ask me any more questions. And so I was never really properly challenged on the topic at all. So it wasn't until I graduated from Calvin and I left Calvin and I went to Tennessee that I was finally confronted, both by, I'll call them secular scientists, all right, at my graduate school, in the graduate program, and my fellow Christians at the new church I attended, who asked me constantly about questions about the age of the earth and, say, evolutionary biology or just origins questions in general. So in 1989, I started my graduate studies in botany at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. At the same time, I became a member of what's called the Bible Presbyterian Church, which is another small Reformed denomination. During that time, I was asked by my fellow graduate students, like they knew that I went to church, and they asked me like, how could you harmonize that, what they thought was a thought of, and I would think of it as too, but as a conservative Christian background. Like, how do you fit that with your, scientific interest? And at the same time, so that's at school. And then on a Sunday, I'm at church and maybe I'm at some social afterwards and I get together, we get talking. And members of the church are asking me the same exact question, but just flipped around, right? They're asking me, how can you be involved in that particular department and doing that kind of research? And how do you interact with them? They had certain assumptions about what I must believe without really even asking me what I believed. And at school, they had certain assumptions about what I must believe without really asking me what I believe. In both cases, the assertion was by almost all individuals involved that there must be some internal conflict. I must be struggling, all right? I must be struggling to find compatibility somehow because these two things didn't seem to match up or mesh. And these questions, they did prove frustrating to me because honestly at the time, I just wasn't able to provide satisfying answers, either to my inquisitors or to myself. Now, sensing my frustration, a member of the church, and I remember exactly how this went down. One Sunday afternoon at another member's home, I had gone to dinner, and this other couple of good friends of mine were there as well. And these friends, we got into a conversation, and we'd had a previous conversation. They came prepared this time. They came with several books and a number of different tracts. And these books and tracts were promoting something called Young Earth, a Young Earth geological perspective, right? Young Earth creationism. And as you are probably aware, Young Earth creationist literature is the work of individuals within a small group of the Christian community that are devoting themselves to providing some kind of alternate interpretation of the geological data than that by secular scientists to try to conclude that the Earth is very, very young. I was told that if I hadn't already read these books, right, that they were really going to help me understand the many issues involved in the question of the age of the Earth and evolutionary biology. Like this was gonna save me, right? If you have questions, you don't have like really articulate answers. You're obviously struggling with this topic, and so here we go. We've provided you I guess you could call it the third set of scriptures, right? The answers to your questions. So I set about to read these most influential books that were recommended to me. Well, do you want to guess what those books were? Well, the primary book that I was presented with was this little book right here. This isn't going to look too exciting, and you're not even going to be able to see the binding on here, but I'm showing it to you first. I'll show you this copy I have because I have a lot of copies of this book. You see that? The Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record and Its Scientific Implications by John Whitcomb and Henry Morris. I had heard of the book, but I really wasn't that familiar with it. And so that was my introduction. Now, let me go back to this copy of it. This particular copy, I think I could hold this up here. Right there, you see, the Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record and Its Scientific Implications. And this copy right down here is printed by, this particular version was printed by the Presbyterian and Reformed Publishing Company, Philadelphia, in 1961. This is a first edition version of the book. Actually, this was one that was in my father's collection that he gave me. And I'm a big collector of first edition and older Young Earth creationist or creationist literature. All right, so I dove into this book, but I want to treat them with enough respect that I would read the book and be able to have a cogent conversation with them later. Well, as I'm reading the book, I'm really struggling to make sense of what I read, right? In light of my own theological convictions and my observations and experiences from science. And that was the beginning. There was a few other books that were actually related to this particular book because they gave me even more literature after that. Because I wasn't just like, oh, this is horrible. Well, this is interesting. I'm finding it kind of intriguing to read, and so I probably didn't put the stops on it quick enough. And so I was deluged with additional literature. I started looking through that, and really over time, I started to realize that I really disagreed with the theological presuppositions of some of these creation scientists, and I became definitely more disillusioned with the scientific theories they set forth. Right, even with my rudimentary knowledge of geology, I shouldn't say rudimentary. Even at the time, I probably had a pretty decent knowledge of geology. I took multiple geology courses in college, and I was surrounded by geology growing up, and I thought about geology a lot. And so reading this book, I wasn't coming in like naive and just being told, here's how you understand geology. I had some sense and some actual practical experience with it. And it just didn't jive with what I was reading. So after I did continue, let's get on with my life here, okay? After receiving my PhD there at the University of Tennessee, I went and took this postdoctoral research position at Southern Illinois. And there I joined another local Presbyterian church. This was a PCA church, Presbyterian Church in America. It's very similar to the Orthodox Presbyterian Church denomination. And the leadership of this particular church were really quite outspoken. I didn't have a lot of options when I went to Carbondale. There was really one Reformed church in that entire area. And so if I was going to remain in a similar theological tradition, I only had one option. That's where I went. The other thing that happened there was the first week I was there, actually I think maybe it was the second week, I met my future wife. And so, yeah, that also had a hold on keeping me at that particular church. I think I still would have gone there for sure, but certainly having an interest in a particular person in that church very early on made a huge difference. I eventually joined this particular church, and there I start to realize that the leadership there actually is pretty outspoken on the age of the earth. See, the pastor at the previous church, at the Bible Presbyterian Church, while I was in my graduate program, had a ton of respect for him, able to have conversations, wide-ranging theological conversations with him. And we just really never talked about the age of the earth, and he never really brought it up in terms of like something that he would preach from the pulpit. And so other than individuals in the church feeling like they needed to press me on that topic, I wasn't really pressed from the leadership of the church itself. But now I'm starting to hear it like more front and center. All right, so I still was rarely asked my specific opinion. I pretty much lay low. Like I said before, I'm pretty much still an introvert, not really willing to kind of rock the boat. I'm not going to challenge anybody. And so I just kind of listen to it, slough it off. And then, I talk my girlfriend's ear off at the time. And then I talk my fiance's wife off of the fiance's ear off. And then still continue to talk to her about it even today, although I try to keep it at a moderate level. She's not really that interested in hearing about every single thing. So that's partly why you're hearing it, because there's an outlet, YouTube, where I can express all my different concerns and interests and thoughts, on this particular topic. Yeah. At the same time, I'm at Southern Illinois University, and I'm doing all this research. I'm also privately expending an enormous amount of effort and research, on both scientific and theological sides of the age of the earth debate. More so the age of the earth thing rather than the evolution idea, because I'm really ensconced now in sort of young earth creationist territory. And the age of the earth is kind of like the biggest thing to tackle first. So one important tool on this path was the discovery of a new thing you might have heard of, and it was called email digests. All right, the world, and also this whole thing called the World Wide Web back in the early 1990s. All right, I discovered that thing. All right, so in particular, there was a number of email discussion groups and lists, and I joined several of them, and several were devoted to the discussion of creationism. And for those of you who are really young, that was, you had this email, would write an email, and it would go out to everyone on the email list. And then when you responded to it, it would go back to everybody. And so it was this sort of slow moving conversation over time. And I joined one particular list that had a very large number of pastors and elders on it. In fact, I was one of the few people that probably wasn't in an official position in the church. I could get on that list because of who I knew. All right, my father being a pastor, minister in a Reformed denomination, and having uncles that are and grandparents that are and so forth are all pastors. I'm known in that particular circle, and so I had, I'll say, special access, right, to other pastors and elders at the time. So we're having these really intense discussions, and I'm like a scientist actually working in the field, and I get a lot of questions, and I don't know a lot of answers, and I am interacting, and generally in an environment where people are not caustic, right? They disagree, but we're having intelligent conversation. Really are. And that was very, very good for me, but also because of how challenging it was, right? So I eventually became really deeply involved in these discussions regarding the age of the earth. And so those are my first experiences at writing and interacting with individuals who had different opinions and really working through some of these issues. So now there was a couple defining moments. We're building up to one of the biggest defining moments, but there was one that came before that then initiated the 1998 one. So one of these moments came when I had a chance to go to Chicago. So I'm in Southern Illinois, and the church there was affiliated with another group and had individuals in that church that went to a well-known church in the Chicago area, and they were having a creation debate going on, right? So like an annual conference, and their topic was on the age of the earth. And of course, several people knew that I was interested in that topic, and I was invited to go up with them to the Chicago area to attend this particular conference. So I had never really been to a creationist conference before, so I was like, yeah, let's check that out. Now this turned out to be a little different than say the Ken Ham conferences of today, right? The individual it turned out that the person that was speaking, there was actually a debate between a old earth creationist and a young earth creationist. And the young earth creationist is somebody who was on the discussion forum and had written a lot, and I had responded to a lot, and we had engaged in a tremendous amount of back and forth. Probably that had gotten pretty heated. I remember that was an especially heated exchange. And so when I heard that he's the conference speaker, kind of wanted to actually go see him in real life. This person, Philip Stott, and Philip Stott is the name of a person who is a theologian from Europe. I'm not talking about that one who's the well-known Philip Stott. We're talking about a rather unknown, I think he has a physics background, from South Africa. And he was being promoted on a North American speaking tour as a defender of the young earth by a tiny organization called Reformation Christian Ministries, which I had some connection to because again, on the discussion forum, there were several people on there that worked for this particular ministry, and I had they were the ones that were primarily interacting with me. So they knew that they had the speaker coming and kind of challenged me this guy will set you straight. So now Stott, he followed most of the typical creation and science thinking. So he would be representing, he would be reading the Genesis flood and all this other stuff, and he's presenting that in this debate and then other talks he gave. There was a debate, and then he gave several additional talks, and he did some Sunday school stuff the next day as well. But he had one particular position, all right, which was extra special and unique, right? And that is, he believed that the earth is at the center of the solar system. He was convinced, based on biblical evidence, that the Bible requires the belief in geocentrism. And he didn't talk about that in the debate. So after attending this debate, I was able to have dinner with Stott and the leadership from the church. All right, so the pastors and several other elders were there, and I was able to join in because I knew one of the people I knew from Southern Illinois was related to people that were in leadership at that particular church. So there I am at this dinner, and the debate and the dinner conversation, was, kind of started to percolate over time. And eventually they're talking about things that were said in the debate. And what amazed me was just how much everyone in that room, all those elders and pastors and other family members, were just amazed at this guy. I mean, it's kind of like listening to Ken Ham. He's got that accent, right? And he's speaking with such authority, and he's wowing them with this science stuff that they don't understand very well. And eventually he begins to work in his whole geocentricity thing. And at first I'm watching this and they're kind of like, oh, I don't know, geocentricity, it's like, really, do we really need to? And then he's pulling out his Bible and showing him verses and, the same kind of logic sometimes that argues that because you have to you're interpreting this in a particular literal fashion. If you interpret these verses, well, that must mean the earth is at the center. And pretty soon he's like, you could just see the room like moving toward like, oh, well, you might really be onto something there. And you were right about all this other stuff. And you might be right about this too. That was just amazing for me to watch. I don't remember saying anything. I don't remember like getting into any arguments there about it. I felt like I'm a guest. I'm just sort of observing. But the observation of like this turn and just how easily people can be manipulated. Now, I don't think that after he left and other events happened, I don't think that, and in fact, I know that the individuals who were in charge there didn't ever fully embrace geocentricity, right? But they were certainly fully on board with young earth creationism. But it certainly led to an enticement toward accepting geocentricity. You could see how the same logic arguments were being used by this speaker, who was a very effective speaker, by the way. Because he was so effective in arguing for young earth creationism, he very much wooed them toward the geocentricity side because they couldn't distinguish the differences in the arguments and the necessity for, they almost found it necessary to believe him. Anyway, taking too much time on this. We got to get to the bigger story. What I did do, though, is, since I didn't say anything there, when I returned home, I wrote a lengthy letter expressing my concerns about Stott's presentation to the elders in the host church, right? So I just wrote this big letter. I actually took Stott's book and I did a whole critique of it. So I'm sure it was like a 15-page thing, and I sent it up. I don't have it anymore. I've tried to find it, but it's probably on like an ancient 5-inch floppy somewhere, buried in my lab, and I don't have anything to even access that data on anymore. So I sent this letter. And of course, it just went into the ether. I never heard anything back about it. But I told them, I was about the danger I thought that these particular ideas were the church, especially the geocentricity side. And I told them how frustrated I was with the inability of the church's leadership to be able to assess the legitimacy of those who they were trusting to give them advice on scientific questions. Right? That they just implicitly entrusted this person because he seemed to have the similar theological commitments, and therefore they just trusted his science. So after I get back from that conference, I'm back on the email discussion list. I do have more interactions with Stott. I don't really hear about that letter. It's unclear to me whether Stott ever found out that I had sent this letter that critiqued his work, his book, and everything. And that was my first real formal attempt to try to articulate the issues I had with young earth creationism and why I was concerned about the growth of young earth creationism and especially geocentrism within the church. And so I had several conversations with fellow church members back in Southern Illinois. They knew that I had gone to this conference, and of course they asked me what did I think of that? And I'm starting to try to give some idea of how I feel about it. But because I was on that discussion group with a lot of other pastors, and then a couple people from that church that were in leadership found out about that, because originally they weren't part of that particular list. But they found out that I was having these discussions, right? And I'm a member of that particular church, and here I am sort of, in their minds, kind of representing, that this church. And I think they're getting worried, why, we're preaching this, and we have this member over here who's out there talking to all these other pastors and elders and telling them things that we wouldn't necessarily agree with. So it's under all of this sort of situation, right? This precipitated, apparently in their mind, somebody's mind in the leadership decided they needed to have a formal discussion. We need to have a formal discussion. You need to have a formal discussion with church leadership. So it was under these conditions I entered into the home of this particular leader of my local church. This isn't actually the pastor of the church. This is actually just an apologist who's working on the campus of Southern Illinois University, but is working within the church, to work with groups and Bible studies at the campus. All right, so I sit down And I'm actually with, at the time, it's now my wife. And we're newly married. Like, we're at most 6 months been married. So we have dinner with he and his family. And, we're having a lot of chit chat. Everything's fine. And then finally, the table gets cleared. And it ends up just being this particular pastor. We'll just call him Derek. And he sits at one end of this long table. And somehow I'm at the other end of this table. And my wife's sitting next to me. And it's just the three of us. And he has a big Bible in front of him. And he opens up his Bible slowly. And he says, I want to begin with these words. And he reads the words of Jesus from Matthew 12:30. And those words were, he who is not with me is against me, and he who does not gather with me scatters. Then he looks up from the Bible across this table and gazes into my eyes, and he says, are you for God? I have to admit, was kind of taken aback. And after recovering sort of my mental balance after a few seconds, my answer was, yes, I am for God. That's my answer. However, it was really clear that he had opened the discussion with this particular volley because it was his belief that, in fact, that I was acting against God by questioning the church's particular view on the age of the earth. I don't think it takes much imagination to realize this conversation is not going to go very far. All right, I'd come in, I knew we were going to talk about, things I'd been saying, and I thought we'd have a continued conversation about some of the issues I saw and some of the types of evidence that I had been talking about. I was prepared to talk a lot about science and like what I'm doing and what I'm seeing. But I can't say I really remember a whole lot after that point. I was so stunned. I was really, really upset. At this point in the discussion, it's not hard to imagine that there was just no productive discussion going on, at least nothing that I remember that was productive. What I do vividly remember is I was left the home and I'm walking out and I have an arrhythmic heart, right? And I have a number of other distinct impressions that I develop over time from this about the nature of the actual creationism debate itself. And those impressions have influenced me to this particular day. One of the biggies is that, this is not going to be any surprise, but I think it's important to say to some people because I think some people just think that if you just pound people with enough facts, right, and you have this logical progression, you show all this evidence, that evidence should win the day. But it's not really about evidence in these discussions, right? It's going to be about the theological questions that are going to be the most important. And if you can't win the theological debate, kind of doesn't matter what all that evidence is. And I don't say there isn't any room for evidence. And certainly I talk a lot about the evidence for an old earth and for other things. And so why do I do that? That's not really to convert the person who is completely convinced that the earth is young. They're not going to be convinced by evidence because they're really not going to be able to see that evidence. And what happened in this particular conversation is the way he starts this is, are you for God or are you against him? And what he did say later, then one other important thing I should tell you is that after he said that, after I said, well, yes, I am for God, is that he told me directly he could not listen to my arguments. Right? He couldn't listen to my arguments because he didn't really believe I was for God. He believed I was from the devil. And you can't listen to the devil's words. You don't want to allow the devil's words into your ears lest they trick you. And so he did not want to hear, he was willing to listen to if we wanted to open the Bible and just talk about Scripture. But he did not want to hear any scientific evidence at all because all that in his mind was tainted and it could not be trusted. And so when you start with that particular foundation for your conversation, you know that scientific evidence is going to do no good at all, nothing. So let me go back really quickly to why do I spend a lot of time actually talking about evidence if evidence doesn't do any good? I am really talking to the person that's a seeker, right? I am not actually talking to Ken Ham or others and thinking, I don't have any illusions that Ken Ham is going to going to see something that I say and say, oh yeah, you're right. I was wrong about that. I'm interpreting that evidence wrong, or I wasn't aware of that particular piece of evidence. And so I think I'm going to throw away my entire worldview and everything I've based everything on to this point and take up your position. That's not going to happen apart from the miraculous working of the Holy Spirit, right? Changing the heart and changing the mind. It's not going to come from a presentation of evidence. However, what I do know is there are many, 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 many people out there who hear the words of creation scientists, but have other experiences, and the words don't immediately convince them, and they have questions. And young earth creation science often doesn't really present fulfilling answers to people who have questions. And they're seeking answers. And they just have this feeling like something's not quite right. Even if they've grown up in young earth creationism, they've heard enough other things and they've never completely bought into the whole thing. And therefore, they have this sense that there's something else there and they're willing to listen. It's those people that read my blog and watch my YouTube station and are interested in learning more about science and the integration of science and faith and how to think about issues of origins, how to assess young earth creationism and so forth, and help them along the path of trying to come to better answers, right? That's the purpose of evidence, not to convince hardcore young earth creationists. So I leave there. I have an arrhythmic heart, which caused huge problems I missed probably 4 weeks of work as a result of that conversation that evening. I was only there for maybe 30 minutes once we finished dinner. And I made it home and I didn't make it to work for multiple weeks after that. Really took it hard. It was very, very difficult on me. I don't really have that problem anymore. I have an arrhythmic heart still, but it's not because of my anxiety over creationism. And it's not over my anxiety of Ken Ham mentioning me today on Answers in Genesis website, right? That has little to no impact at all on sort of my angst or anything about it. I don't get upset about that at all. So it was made really clear to me that physical evidence was going to be treated as irrelevant coming from me. I'm tainted. I have this education that he doesn't trust. I'm a product of the system, right? I've accepted this old earth paradigm. It was also obvious to me that he knew some of the young earth creationist literature and he was completely convinced by the evidence, the scientific evidence. Right? So not only can he not listen to my evidence because it's of the devil, he has scientific evidence and he is actually using that as a reason for his faith. It's not just from the Bible. And this is a lot of young earth creationists. They really are standing on that pile of evidence that they believe is completely supportive of a young earth. He took that, the Genesis flood is this, really impressive piece of work. And he had read this particular book. And so he doesn't know science at all, but he was convinced that they had done this admirable job of proposing this alternative geological paradigm. At the end of the day, I just found myself really frustrated, right? I spent weeks not feeling well and frustrated with just thinking through what could I have done differently or how am I supposed to communicate with an individual like this, right? And part of my frustration is that doctrinally, in terms of like our conversations about other theological topics, we could have a back and forth and we could have a productive discussion. And I could with the other pastors and other people in that church have a very engaging discussion, which I would say is an evidence-based discussion. Because we are arguing, we're making arguments based on things in Scripture, but we're also using like logical arguments about how to interpret the methods of interpretation and so forth, and I would say relatively undogmatic, conversations. But when it comes to this particular topic, suddenly the doors are completely shut, and it's like us and them. And this is the influence of a book like this, and specifically later on of Ken Ham, making it this dichotomous choice that one must make, and there can't even really be true conversation involved. So I knew he wasn't unintelligent. I knew he was capable of having serious discussion. I had interacted, like I said, with him on many unrelated topics. he just was just convinced of a young earth that it was required by scriptures, and he felt emboldened by his understanding of creation science and his defense of his theological position, right? The creation science literature had convinced him that he was on the right path and that he was standing on the shoulders of giants. So this whole incident really made me, I would say, more acutely aware of the influence of this creation science literature. That it wasn't just on the lay Christian, on the average person in the pew or person that's doing homeschooling, but this was something that was really influencing the leadership of the church. And now it's sort of like coming as this top-down thing. It used to be kind of more of a grassroots thing coming up in the church, but now it comes from both ends. This particular encounter, right, in combination with a whole bunch of other events that were occurring around the same time, they're what really spurred me to get really serious about investigating, and I'll say really to obsession, both the scientific and the theological claims of creation science, which now has been going on for 35 years. So many years after being hit with the question, are you for or against God? I do have the same answer I had then. However, I recognize now that that initial question was applied inappropriately. I'm sure I understood that it was inappropriate at the time, but I didn't know why it was inappropriate. I didn't know how to explain why it was inappropriate. See, it should have been plain from the witness of my life, from my other actions in the church, the fact that I was conscientiously involved in many other activities, routinely spoke up in things like Sunday schools. And I mean, I teach Sunday school adult Sunday school lessons and other things in churches today. So it should have been he should have been acutely aware of my overall witness. And so I wasn't against God like the Pharisees. And that's who Christ was addressing. Right? The context of that particular statement is Jesus is addressing the Pharisees. Right? He's not addressing fellow Christians, those who have all the, at least appearances, and I will say some fruits of the Spirit showing evidence in my life that I am a Christian, a professing Christian. And that's not a question that is asked of fellow Christians. Had this pastor simply elected to share that he was concerned that I might be misguided in my convictions, like on this particular topic. I'm worried about your soul even. Like, I think this is a really important topic, and I think we'd like to discuss it. As a Christian, you should be concerned about this as well. I think there could have been a fruitful dialogue. I've had many, many such dialogues since then. However, he chose to approach me in a way that I'll say is not uncommon among believers, right? Especially among young earth creationists, whose sole experience with science has been through the creation science literature now. I'm more convinced today that I was then, that both the theological and scientific assumptions and the political motivations that undergird the whole creation science movement are in need of detailed scrutiny by the Christian community. The seeds of my blog, which is a 10-year endeavor, which was really started as an extension of discussions I've had with friends who, since I've been writing so much to my friends, I decided to make that more public. And part of that also was just a way of like exploring topics, exploring issues. And by writing it out, there's nothing better than writing to sort of like see if you can express an idea rather than just like get it out of your head. And it's also a way to like improve my writing, which I knew I needed to improve a lot. And it's really helped in those things. And now I've got this YouTube channel, and it's sort of like the same thing. It's an extension of my own explorations, my own pushing my own ideas and my own thoughts forward, and being able to interact with all of you out there who will then help refine my ideas over time. But all that really lies in the pursuit of this idea that I need to thoroughly examine the validity of what's being published in the name of creation science. I don't do this because I wish to cause strife in the church. I wish to split the church. I wish to divide the church. I wish to harm the church. No, it's because I love the church. Ultimately, that's the answer of like, why do I do this? Why spend so much time? Why am I up past midnight right now making this video when everybody else in the house is asleep? And I still have to get up early in the morning. Why spend that amount of time doing that? I tell you, it's not for the clicks and for making money or something like that. Not making any money. right? It's got to be for something else. What is it? It's actually for the love of the church. I mean, I also like science, and I like science communication. I think it's important for the public to understand science better. There's a whole component of that. I'm interested in the public communication of science as a discipline. But at the end of the day, the real driving force, all right, and the reason why I'm spending a lot of time on topics that have to do with science and faith, even if I touch other topics, that's really the core thing that brings me back and gives me the incentive to be up late at night as I am right now, is because I love the church and I believe in protecting the purity of the church, or the purity of the theology of the church. And in order to do that, that requires that the church examine itself continuously. So it needs to continuously reform itself, be reformed, continually examine itself. It doesn't need to become ensnared with man-made traditions and arguments that really aren't scriptural. So I said before, people ask me all the time. I get this question on Facebook, on the comments section, why I spend so much time into this. You know, I am passionate about the truth and doing God's work. It keeps me intellectually engaged. It makes me a better teacher. There's nothing like explaining hard topics to help you. I have a whole bunch of other thoughts about like motivators for me and things that I am, reasons I'm doing what I'm doing beyond just these basic things. But to go back to that central thing, like the thing that has happened to me that shaped my views, the people I've interacted with, and my experiences with creation science, all of those have kind of combined over time to lead me to have such an intense interest in this area. And again, it's all for the sake of reforming the church and constantly challenging ourselves to make ourselves to come to a better understanding of God's world. Because I think that brings glory to God, is doing that. But I do want to address one thing that I get criticism for. And I almost have to laugh about it. I often hear young earth creationists who will say that Christians such as myself, or myself in particular, they want to call me out. You know, they say, the reason you're calling out young earth creationists for error is because you're afraid of losing your job, right? You're afraid to voice an opinion of young earth creationists, otherwise you'll lose your job. You want the respect of your colleagues, right? You want them to respect you, so you're bashing young earth creationism. Or you want to make money selling books and giving talks and having a YouTube channel and having a blog. So do I do this for money? Definitely not, right? I paid for upgraded blog so there'd be no ads for all of you to have to look at. I'm not monetized on YouTube. I don't have a Patreon. There's nothing wrong with those who do those things, and I don't think there's anything wrong with people wishing to help subsidize their hobby, I guess, because you could consider this an extended hobby of mine. But I really have to laugh when I hear young earth creationists accuse folks like myself as like selling out and somehow that we're benefiting from it, right? No, this actually costs me money, and it's obviously costing me a lot of time. It takes a lot of sacrifices on my part to do this. You know, if I had funneled all my efforts, if I was still at the lab, I mean, I was in my office until 10 p.m. this evening. And then I came home. I watched another YouTube video of a friend of mine, and now I'm making this particular YouTube video, and it's getting to be quite late. It's almost 1 o'clock in the morning. And that's really late for an old guy like me. So, but if I had funneled all those efforts I spent into pursuing research grants, right, I would have gotten a lot better raises over the last 10 years, and I would be making a lot more money on my job. You know, I would be getting grants that would be paying for my summer salary, right? Spending this much time costs me more publications. If I had more publications, I would not have to teach quite as much as I do, and I wouldn't have to maybe do as much service as I do. And potentially I would have some more time to be able to do this, right? But doing this costs me the ability to be more successful in the job. I still do my job, and I think I do it very well. But I'm not going to the 100th degree and doing 10 times. I'm not doing as much as I could to be enormously successful in terms of being a famous scientist, right? It's not getting me any glory, and it's certainly not getting me paid at all. So what if I had an epiphany? I think about this sometimes. I like when creationists criticize and say, like, you're doing all this for fame and glory. And I'm like, what are you talking about? What if I had an epiphany? I was suddenly converted to being young earth. I would have the experience and an incredible story, a conversion story. I would be absolutely irresistible to big young earth creationist ministries. I would get hired as regular staff there with a full salary. And I could do this all day long, right? I mean, given the type of books they write, I could write a book every 6 months for them. I could be writing a bunch of articles. I'd be a dynamic speaker. Honestly, I think I would be a much more dynamic speaker than a lot of the ones they have there. In other words, I wouldn't lose my livelihood. I would gain an opportunity to get a full-time job. I could do this stuff all day long, right? I could be writing articles. Presumably, I would like doing it too, because if I converted, I would be able to just do the same thing I'm doing now, but I'd be doing it with a young earth creationist perspective, and I could do it all the time. I would have adoring crowds cheering for my every move, right? I'd be going and giving talks to packed out crowds of thousands of people. Yeah, no, what I am doing, the way I'm doing it, is a sacrifice to the community, right? So that's my story. I mean, I absolutely appreciate it. 1,000 subscribers is amazing. I never really thought I would ever have that many. It's such a niche topic. I have such an eclectic set of interests. And I have to many of you, an odd combination of particular theological convictions and interest and understanding of science. And so for many people, I think maybe you're subscribers because you're curious. And it's like, he's such an oddball and like kind of weird to think about these things as a different way, a different thing than I've heard before. And you've seen I have a whole bunch of different types of videos, and I plan on being even more diverse in the future. And you're certainly going to, because I have an extremely diverse audience, from probably very theologically conservative to theologically liberal Christians to agnostics to outright atheists, right? Each of which find different interest in what I'm saying. And so it's an audience I can't possibly please everyone with every video. I'm always going to find people who disagree on all these things. But I found I'm pretty comfortable with disagreement now. Doesn't cause me a lot of angst, and I find it really interesting and challenging. It's good to be challenged. It's dangerous not to be challenged and allow yourself to explore ideas and to convince yourself and come to positions that you're comfortable with you're comfortable with them because you've explored that particular space, rather than just avoiding a topic and then just finding some sort of comfort zone and believing something and not allowing any inconvenient facts to kind of get in the way. So what am I going to do in the future? Why should you stick around? I don't know. Maybe you won't stick around after hearing this. This is one kind of perspective on like what's my motivating factor. And so this is obviously going to guide sort of my future discussions. But I'm hoping that you see just from this brief snapshot of some of my own history, sort of like getting into creationism, being introduced to it, and why I'm interested in discussing it, that maybe it'll help you understand why sometimes I take maybe an angle in a video that kind of shocks you or surprises you. Like, why is he talking about this right now? Like maybe you're expecting a straight science video, and maybe it sounds like a straight science video because a lot of them I kind of like go through the science story. And then often I kind of like at the end, kind of like throw in this whole creationism thing. I get comments all the time on the blog, like, what's going on? Why are we talking about this now? But that's just the way it's going to be. So just have to accept that. Okay, I've gotten to the point where I'm just starting to ramble because I don't know how to exactly cut myself off on some of these things. Like this is sort of what I do. I mean, part of what interests me about YouTube and writing to some extent is that it is a free-flowing sort of a free flow of ideas, and as I'm exploring those ideas, just like verbally saying them out loud, I'm learning something myself, right? This isn't just about education. I'm not just like I have talked about the purpose of education and professors. It's not just about like, I have this knowledge and I'm just communicating that knowledge to you. Thou shalt learn, what I have to say. And if you don't like it, I guess you don't have to listen to me. No, I'm engaged in the learning process. Because although I'm not directly interacting, because this isn't a live video, you are seeing me learning as I'm thinking about these topics, as I'm expressing myself. I'm actually in my head, radically trying to assess, like, why am I saying what I'm saying even at this very moment? Because I haven't scripted this part. Why did I start talking about this topic? How is it that I was led down this particular path? And how does that make me who I am? And how might that actually be expressing something that other people are thinking too? Because I think that's part of what I'm doing, is I'm trying to express concerns and ideas and questions that people have, some questions they may not realize they even have until they hear me. They're like, yeah, that's an interesting question. And a lot of times I'm asking that question because I think it's an interesting question. And it's not necessarily that I have like it all worked out and I know the answer, but asking interesting questions and then getting yourself to go through the thought process of like, well, what do I know about that? And how does that enter? Oh, I just thought of something else. I didn't think about that piece of data, or I didn't think about that particular Bible verse, or I didn't think about that particular study. And coming to the realization sometimes, oh, I don't really understand this. Well, that's actually useful to figure out you don't understand something. So that's what's really been great about this trip, right? That's what it is. I mean, this trip through making all the videos I've made for this YouTube station has led me to a new level of understanding of a lot of different issues that at one time I probably thought I knew pretty well. So that's something that bothers me about, like, say, young earth creationism. It kind of stifles that learning process. It's sort of like, here's the answer. Don't dare think about this any further. Don't like try to get underneath the hood and figure out how this really works, right? It's safer for you to just believe it, because if you ask a question and you ask a hard question, it could lead you down a path of thinking through things that might make you start to question the things we told you are true. And that for a lot of people is a scary thing, because they think, oh, well, that's going to shake the foundations of my faith, or that could lead me down the slippery slope, right? Away from the things that I know are true. But I don't see it that way at all. I think that that everybody is really obligated to not just live in a shell in this world and hide themselves. What young earth creationists often are doing, some, not all, but some, what they're doing is they're trying to surround themselves with a shell, right? They're saying, I'm in this world that is decaying and falling apart and is broken because of sin. And my real goal, right, is heaven. And I'm just waiting to get to heaven, as if there's no job to do here, right? I think God has given us a job to do here, and we're here for a reason. And so rather than exploring what that reason is and trying to understand his world and bring glory to God in this particular life, like understanding his world is part of giving God his glory, we just cover ourselves with this shell of protection. I don't want the outside world in. I want to just protect myself, keep myself as pure as possible, and then get to death so that I can get to resurrection, right? Get to the next life. And so there's no sense of exploration. There's no sense of, I don't want to endanger myself of exposing myself. It's kind of like the eunuchs of old. See, I got myself going on a new topic here, even though I thought I was done. It's kind of like the age-old debates from, like, say, even the Middle Ages or before, of like, what's the most pure way or proper way to go about understanding God's word and the way to live, right? And there was, monasteries, right, set up where you would go and you isolate yourself and you're totally devoted to studying God's word, and you're just excluding the external world at all. You don't want any part of the external world, because the external world is a thing that's infected and it's bad. And so you just completely avoid it. As opposed to saying, I'm supposed to go out into the world. I'm supposed to transform this world. How can you transform a world that's doomed? But we are called to transform the world. And oh boy, I don't want to go down this path too far, because I really should be done. But the point is that you can't just put yourself in this shell. And this is what Answers in Genesis does really well. It's like, here's the answers book. And if you want to know the answer, just look it up in this book, and you got a quick paragraph and you'll know the answer, and then you can move on to more important topics. Right? So do all these things in your life, and don't worry about all these big questions about origins and where you came from and what the meaning of life is outside of just these few principles we've given you. Nope, not that way. I think that you can have a much fuller, deeper understanding of this world. I think you can come to a deeper understanding of God and your relationship with him if you're willing to explore and understand his creation, instead of isolating your world, yourself from that creation. Yeah, okay, now I'm done. I really am. I really am done. I gotta go. It's past 1 o'clock, which is like way past. I shouldn't even be. Well, you can probably tell I can't think straight anymore at this particular time at night. Anyway, super appreciative of 1,000 subscribers. I look forward to what's coming in the next year. Who knows where this path will lead me, and who knows what we'll talk about. But I'm excited because there's no end to the questions that we can ask, and there's no end to the things that we can talk about. Always exploring, always learning new things. No teacher is any good if they're not actually learning when they're doing what they're doing. So thanks again. We'll talk to you later.